Now let's consider another type of loop. So let's comment this out. And the for loop is a common type of method or operator in all programming. So in a for loop, the original way of looking at a for loop was that we would have some index that we are incrementing. So if we say for a equals, let's start from a value of 1, and then we have a terminator condition. So the for loop syntax is that there are actually 3 parts in your for statement. The first part is to initialize an index. So in this case, our index is the variable a. So we do implicitly define the variable a, and then we set the initial value for a as well. So the compiler will, when it looks at this for loop, it will say, okay, that's the variable of interest to you. So you've initialized it to this value. So that's what's in the first part of the statement. And then in the next part, we have to state the termination condition. So we can say here, a must be less than 5 in this loop. And then in the last case, we must instruct the compiler in what to do with the value of a during the execution. So we can say a equals a plus 1, for instance. And then this is the code block that it must run while all this is happening. So let's console.log a. So if we run this, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4. So we can see it has initialized our index with a value of 1, and it's respecting this condition here that a must be less than 5. We can see we don't reach a value of 5, and we can see that it's incrementing the value of a. So we can change this to be a less than or equal to 5, for instance. And so now the 5 will appear if we change the condition to that. We can also run from any initial value. So if we start from -10, for instance, then we can see we start from -10 and we go up to 5, and we can increment in whatever from whatever value we want. So let's put this back to a 1, and if we increment in 0.5, for example, then that's those are the values that will pass through during this loop. So that's a traditional for loop. And for loops are not generally used for out of interest for the actual value of the variable. Most of the time, we run for loops on things like on arrays. So let's comment this out. Let's create an array here. So var b equals, and let's say 10, 20, 30, 40, and then we can write a for loop here for var a equals 0. So we initialize it because we know the index position start from 0. And then our condition for ending is that a is, or the condition for us to stay in the loop is that a must be less than the length of the array b. So arrays have the attribute length. So as long as b is less than the end position for b, stay in the loop. And then we want to increment the value of a. And the shorthand for that is a++, like that. So that's our iterator on an array. So we can console.log b. And as we said before, to reference a value of an array, we use square brackets. And in here, we provide the array position. So we know a is running from 0 until the end. So we can use a as our index. And if we console log that, you can see 10, 20, 30, 40. So it's run through all of that. If, for instance, you wanted to run to less than the length, so if we say b.length -1, then you can see it gives us just 10 to 30. And if you didn't want to start from the very first position, if you started from the second, then You can see it's 20 and 30. So we have a lot of control over the behavior of the index, and we can iterate over an array in this way. Okay, so that's a for loop using it in the traditional way. Now, there are more modern ways of iterating through lists and arrays and so on. And so you can, instead of doing it this way, you can directly operate on the array B. So it may seem inefficient that we have to create an index just to loop over values of an array, because this array already exists in memory, and it should be possible to just run through the values of the array more implicitly, if you like. And so we could use a for loop. So we could say for, and we could use a new variable here for bi, and we can use the keyword of, for bi of b. So instead of here, we just use for with 3 statements in it, or 3 checks, or 3 conditions. Here we have an alternate way to use the for loop. So we initialize an index variable, or not an index variable, we initialize a variable, and using the of keyword, it will assign the value of b in the array to bi. So in other words, the for loop understands that we are iterating over an array, and so it will run us through each value of that array. So if we console log this out, console.log bi, then it's given us each value in turn. So bi is each value of the array. And you see, in this case, we don't have to create a separate variable. So you could think of this as saving some memory. So that's if we want to directly access each element of the array. But there are often cases where we do also want to know at what position we are when we are iterating through the array. So in that case, there is yet another way of using the for loop. So in this case, we would say for var, and let's call it b index to emphasize that it's the index. And now we use the in keyword. So this is a for in loop. So for var b idx in b will now create an index for us, and then to reference the value of b, we can use that index. And first, let's just see what the index is. So b idx, and that's just a straightforward counter starting from 0, going just before the end of the array. So we can use this now. Let's just create a bit of a separator here, and we can now reference each element of the array. So b e idx, right? So using the square bracket notation, we reference each value of the array b. And now when we run this, we can see on the first iteration, we are referencing with b idx the first position, which has the value of 10 in that array. And then after that block runs, then we go to the next index position. So that's a 1, which points to the second position. And at the second position, we have the value 20 and so on. So that's the in variant of the for loop, right? So for in the traditional sense is like this. Then you've got for off. So that's for the case where we don't really care about the index position. We just want the value of the array. Then we can use off. But if you might need the index position and the value, then you'd rather work through the index position, and then you can just reference from your array that index position. So that's the that's using for loops. there is yet another way to iterate over a list. So we did talk about this previously, but let's just do it here for completeness. So if we have B, we can, there is a method baked into an array, right? When we used the square bracket notation here, this signified that B was an array, and the array prototype does have a map method. So if we state here b.map, then we can create a function here, and the first argument of that function will be the value at each of those positions. So if we console.log bi, then you can see we are referencing each element of the array. In map, sometimes you might need the index position. So if you just include a second argument here, the idx, then you can use that as well. So here, the idx, let's just put that. So let's console log a short array, which just tells us about the current position. So if we run this, you can see in the first position, the index value is what we get in the second argument there. And then the actual function value is the first argument, bi. So that's using map. There is another method in the array prototype called reduce. So reduce. And as the name suggests, the reduce function actually helps you to create aggregates. So sometimes you want to run over a data set and extract one value. So for example, if you want to get just the total number, then you can use the reduce method. So in this case, we have to provide an initial value for, right? We are trying to create now some other number. So we are creating a different number. So we have to specify an initial value for the number, and then we have to return so B naught, let's call it B naught, and we will return some operation that we do on this B naught. So we will say return B naught plus, and then we provide a second argument, which is bi. So return B naught plus bi, and we can state an initial value here, 0. So this looks a bit complicated, but in essence, the reduce method takes two arguments, the first argument being a function and the second argument being an initial value. So this initial value will be allocated to the first argument here, b naught, and then on the first iteration, b naught is a 0, and bi is the ith position. I actually just want to test that this runs first of all. That did run, but we need to set an outcome here. So set some b, and let's console log that result. So log b, right? And if you look at that, the result of 100, if you think of it, 10 plus 20 is 30, 30 plus 30 is 60, 60 plus 40 is 100. So yes, it has given us the sum. And I just want to check my order of variables here. So let's expand out this code block and console.log. And I'm going to use the object notation. So let's say b naught and bi. So let's see what those values are as we are reducing across the array. So you can see that b naught is incrementing, bi is simply each element of the array. So when we run a reducer on an array, it will substitute each value for the array as the second argument, and it knows that we are trying to get some aggregate number out. So that aggregate number will appear as a variable in the first position. And we also supply an initializer here. So in the second argument to reduce, we set the initial value for the aggregate, and then when reduce runs on each element of the array, it will use that value. So B naught initially has a value of 0. And you can see here in the first iteration, B naught has that value of 0. And then after the code block runs, you can see that we are getting out a value of B naught plus BI. So B naught plus BI is 10 in this case. And so what gets returned here gets allocated to this value B naught. So on the next iteration, B naught will have a value of the sum of these two, which is 10. So here we can see on the next iteration, we have a value of 10. And now we are looking at the second element of the array. And we know that according to the code that we set up, it's going to add those two. So 10 plus 20 is 30. So the result returned is a 30. So the 30 will re-enter here. So B naught will have a value of 30 next. And we can see that here. So B naught is 30. And it so happens that the third value is also a 30 in our array. So those will add together, giving us 60. So that's the next value of B naught. And then the fourth value in the array is 40. And then in this last iteration, we add those two together and we get a value of 100. And now this has completed running. So it allocates that 100 here, and that's our sum. So this is a nice compact way if we want to run over a loop, run over a list and get one number out. So sometimes we want to calculate the sum, or we want to calculate the mean, or some other kind of aggregate value. And so reduce helps us do that efficiently. Okay, so that's in a sense strayed into iterators that we have on lists and arrays. For our objects, let's think about objects now, JSON objects. So let's create another object here. So var C equals, and let's make a JSON object that looks like this. So let's say C has attributes A, which is 10, and B, which is 20, and C, which is, let's say it's a string. And so, yeah, the fact that we are naming this variable C, that doesn't interfere with the fact that C has an attribute called C. So in much the same way, a parent can name their child after them. The child is a different entity to the parent. So, but you can reference the child by using the dot notation listing C.C, for example. And let's say we also have a sub object D. So let's say D has D1, 10, and D2, 20. So that's our JSON object, which we talked about previously. And we can loop through this JSON object. So if we use the for, and let's say CI of C, then that will give the value of C at that position. So I think, let's see if this works. Console.log CI. Okay, so it says C is not iterable. We can't use the off keyword. We can use the in keyword. So we can say here CIDX. So if you list CIDX here, then that's going to give us the key. So remember, these are key value pairs. So that's going to give us the keys. So if we run this, we can see we've got A, B, C, D, right? So those are all the keys here. And we can then also reference the value at that key using that index. So let's just separate each iteration here, and then console.log C and CIDX. So doing that, you can see we know that the attribute A has the value 10, B is 20, C is hello, and we can see all that there. And there you can see the sub object for D as well. So that's how we can iterate over the attributes of an object and extract the values and so on. There is another thing we could do with objects. So we could extract the attribute names without using a for loop. So we could instead do this as object.keys. So remember in the JSON object video, we talked about object.keys and object.values. So if we extract the keys, right, the attribute names of C, then we get an array, right? So let's just comment this out. So we will get an array here. We can just check that. So console.log that. So we've got this array. Now we've just shown up here that we can iterate over an array in different ways. So we can actually run for loops using of or in, and or we can use map and reduce. So let's use map on this. So we've extracted the attribute names as an array, and so we can call on map using the attribute. So let's just call it attr. And oops, this is supposed to be a function first of all. So we can supply as our variable attr. So that's the attribute name. You can name this whatever you like, and then we can console.log C using that attribute. So we have extracted all the attribute names from the object C, and we are iterating over all those attribute names. And when we map over it, we can extract the attribute name itself from the array of attribute names. So that's the current attribute name, and we can log out the value of C at that attribute or in that attribute. And we can see we get the expected result there. So of course we can do that, and we can also just plot out the values. So if we do object.values of C, and then if we map over those for the function, and this time it's the attribute value. So console.log attr val. And actually, let's compare them. So let's keep this one running, and let's just put a separator between. So console.log and with the dots. And you see in the first case, we are iterating over the attributes, but we are logging out the value of the attribute. Let's actually just show the attribute itself, right? For a proper comparison, let's only show the value that's being used in the map function. And here in the map function, now we are referencing the values instead. So let's run that. And so you can see in the first case, the argument here is the attribute name because we used object.keys. In the second case, using object.values, when we use the map function, then the value, this is actually the value in our JSON object. Okay, so these are all iterators. So yeah, the video started here, I guess. So this is the for loop in the most traditional sense, the 3-statement type of for loop. And then in more modern times, we have in and off. So we can, with the off keyword, we can run through each value of the array. Using the in keyword, we can run through each index position. And then even more modern than that, we have the map and reduce methods for arrays. And then if we want to iterate over a JSON object, we can to some extent do that using a for in, but we can also extract the attribute names using object.keys. And then because it's now a list, then we can use all those these modern methods for working across the attributes of an object.